a rise in debt isn't an indication that we're living beyond our means, because, as Fettes puts it, one person's debt is another person's asset. Or, as I equivalently put it, debt is money we owe to ourselves. It would really take the mask off this argument if he just gave one example. I'm going to give you one example right now that's very telling. Who owns government bonds? Who owns this debt? Microsoft does. Microsoft is a company with $133 billion to spend. And they have put 84% of that money into government bonds. That's over 111 billion US dollars. Now, although it is hypothetically true that a poor person might scrape their money together and buy a government bond, it's incredibly unlikely. Poor people and even middle-class people do not have money to spare on government bonds. And even during World War II, you may have a few heartwarming examples of poor people who managed to buy bonds, managed to support the war effort, buy government debt, and make a few dollars back on their investment. Nevertheless, if you look at the math, disproportionately, it is the richest of the rich who will benefit from the government offering debt.
Having debt held by your wealthy is only in the future going to transfer that taxes, that burden in our future generations of those poor and middle income classes paying that their taxes to finance that debt that the wealthy owns, to pay it back for themselves. So what's going to happen? They're going to pay it. They're not getting anything back. They're not getting anything back with interest. But the problem is that's going to transfer money away from these households, these poor and middle income Americans, up.
And then the problem becomes much more crippling when you talk about middle class people and poor people who do not have the option to profit from government debt the way Microsoft is. And you ask them, why are you paying taxes? Do you realize that the more and more the American government is in debt, the greater and greater a percentage of your income is going to make the rich richer, and by the same token, it's making you poorer. Although it is true that in Western democracies, rich people pay the vast majority of taxes. In fact, it seems incredible if you look at a pie chart of United States tax collection of the money the government gathers from the population. It's amazing how much of it comes from the richest 1%, the richest 5%, the richest 20% of the country. Although that is true, nevertheless, if you have ever been among the working poor, you know just how hard it is to part with the few $100s the government is taking from you in taxes. I can remember working at Starbucks and the money being taken out of my paycheck. To me, that was a really appreciable loss when I was trying to save up money to start a new life after university and so on. Every few $100s the government took away from me really mattered. I may have had the comforting delusion that the money being taken away from me as a poor, underemployed university student working at Starbucks, I may have had the comforting delusion that the money being taken away from me was to help people even poorer than myself. I think that's a very, very powerful notion of social responsibility that motivates the poor and the middle class to pay their taxes. And it's very damaging to that sense of, the ethos of the taxpayer if we can admit that the government's tax dollars are in fact being used to make the rich richer, to make the richest people and the wealthiest corporations richer. The blindingly obvious fact about government debt as such, the mechanism of government raising money through the selling of government bonds, is that it makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. And I'm going to talk it through with you in this video. This is not any kind of crazy conspiracy theory. It's a blindingly obvious fact of 21st century economics that neither the left wing nor the right wing are talking about. Especially since the year 2008, we've become accustomed to a very insincere dance in which the left wing is pro-debt and pro-deficit. They're just in favor of expanding I don't know, government spending, whether to help the poor or perhaps to invade Afghanistan, military occupation of Iraq, the other things that cost billions and billions of dollars taxpayers' money. But in any case, the left wing has generally taken up the position of advocating for more debt, for more deficit spending, whereas the right wing has expressed reservations about this. Although, as you all know, in the United States, the Republican Party has lavished money on projects such as the invasion of Afghanistan. Lately, they're talking about spending a lot of money on building a wall between the United States and Mexico. So when they want to spend money, the Republican Party are quizzically all of a sudden in favor of debt and deficit spending. Paul Krugman is one of the world's most influential people. I think I can say he's one of the world's most powerful people. He's an economist, and he is left of center. I would not say he is far left wing, but he's perhaps on the left side of the Democrat Party in the United States. I'm going to quote Paul Krugman here. And this is in some ways a completely typical left of center position, especially since the year 2008. Antonio Fates, commenting on recent work on deleveraging or the lack thereof, emphasizes one of my favorite points. No, debt does not mean that we're stealing from future generations. Globally, and for the most part even within countries, a rise in debt isn't an indication that we're living beyond our means, because, as Fates puts it, one person's debt is another person's asset. Or, as I equivalently put it, debt is money we owe to ourselves. So that is dishonest in a profoundly important way. Saying that debt consists of money taken away from some people and given to other people very much intentionally obfuscates the mechanism, which has been clear since the invention of government bonds, government debt, that what it does is take money away from the poor and the middle class and give it to the richest people and richest corporations in our society.
We often think about these debts as putting it at the backs on our children and our children's children, and the way we're going in our children's children's children. But it really matters of whose children are paying this debt back. So for that 70%, if we look back at our previous wars, World War I and World War II that was mentioned, we had these bond campaigns. So low and middle income Americans can go down to the post office as low as 10 cents at a time and start buying government debt. And they're going to save that government debt until when they're ready to cash it in. So you today...
It's an investment.
It's an investment. So they're going to get eventually that money back, just like many people do today who can afford to do that. So who can afford to do that? Your wealthy Americans, those who are lucky to have retirement accounts, probably own a portfolio, hold some government debt. Having debt held by your wealthy is only in the future going to transfer that taxes, that burden in our future generations of those poor and middle income classes, paying their taxes to finance that debt that the wealthy owns, to pay it back for themselves. So what's going to happen? They're going to pay it. They're not getting anything back. They're not getting anything back with interest. But the problem is that's going to transfer money away from these households, these poor and middle income Americans, up.
Psychologically and culturally, people seem to think of buying government bonds as a positive thing. They think of it in a positive way because of the experience of World War II. The idea that the average man or even a poor person could scrape some money together and buy war bonds, that they could buy government debt, that they could lend their money to the government, and that they could help the government defeat the Nazis. They could help the United States defeat the Germans. They could help England defeat the Germans. And at the same time, they could make some sort of profit for themselves, that all society could become war profiteers. That's become a very powerful propaganda notion that really shaped the transition in Western democracies to governments being massively reliant on debt and nobody really questioning who gets rich and who gets poor from this transaction. As Paul Krugman says here so misleadingly, after all, it's merely an interaction of one person with another person. One person's debt is another person's asset. Yes, indeed, it would really take the mask off this argument if he just gave one example. I'm going to give you one example right now that's very telling. Who owns government bonds? Who owns this debt? Microsoft does. Microsoft is a company with $133 billion to spend. And they have put 84% of that money into government bonds. That's over 111 billion US dollars. Now, although it is hypothetically true that a poor person might scrape their money together and buy a government bond, it's incredibly unlikely. Poor people and even middle-class people do not have money to spare on government bonds. And even during World War II, you may have a few heartwarming examples of poor people who managed to buy bonds, managed to support the war effort, buy government debt, and make a few dollars back on their investment. Nevertheless, if you look at the math, disproportionately, it is the richest of the rich who will benefit from the government offering debt, offering to pay interest on bonds. Partly, of course, because those are the people who have the money to spend, partly for other economic and cultural reasons. Now, the one aspect of this story that does get discussed in economics and politics in the 21st century is what's called the crowding out effect. Conservatives, right-wingers, and libertarians will complain that there's a profound problem throughout the economy because Microsoft, for example, out of their $133 billion, if they're putting more than $100 billion of that into the government's hands, if they're taking that money and not using it to innovate new computers, they're not using it to research how to make better software or better hardware or something, they're not using it to research how to put a man on the moon or a cure for cancer. They're taking over $100 billion that investors have given them. And investors have given them that money with the hope that they will make more computers, make better computers, that sort of thing. And instead, Microsoft is profiting from taxpayers. That's what this is. When they, quote unquote, invest in U.S. government and agency securities, when they buy government bonds, when they buy public debt, what they're doing is profiting from taxpayers. Taxpayers will pay them money by the government. What the right-wing conservatives and libertarians will complain about is that this has a dampening effect on innovation, that this in many ways robs capitalism of the main mechanisms of its kind of strength, vitality, and even transparency, right? If you have bought stock in Microsoft, if you've invested in Microsoft, but in reality, what you're doing is indirectly buying government savings bonds, what sense does the stock market make? What sense does the price or value of Microsoft as a company make? And yes, if you just take a moment to imagine throughout the whole economy, the fact that there are corporations and companies everywhere, and indeed, of course, banks themselves, financial institutions themselves, investment firms, brokerages, there are all kinds of companies that instead of using their money in ways that are truly productive, instead of using money that they have invested in their company to employ people, instead they're giving that money to the government so that the government can invade Afghanistan, so the government can go into debt, operating hospitals, all the things the government does, good and bad. That does indeed erode the conceptual and pragmatic basis of what capitalism is supposed to be. And that complaint only comes from the right wing. I have never once heard anyone on the right wing, neither libertarian nor conservative, I have never once heard any of them complain that very fundamentally what this mechanism is doing is taking money away from the poor, taking money away from the middle class, and giving it to the richest people in our society. It is making the rich richer, whether those are individuals who are rich, who decide to buy government bonds, government debt, or if it's a corporation like Microsoft that's rich. So that is very fundamentally the mechanism of what government debt is. And even in the, morally uplifting context of World War II propaganda, That is, in fact, what government debt always has been. So I say again, it is true that the vast majority of the tax money collected by the government in the United States is collected from wealthy people. As a larger and larger percentage of America's budget is spent, quote unquote, paying down the debt, or sometimes it's said, as more and more of the government budget is spent paying for interest on the debt, that means that a larger and larger percentage of the taxes paid by the rich are going to other rich people and corporations that happen to own government debt. So yes, that would be, if only rich people paid tax, it would still be very, very difficult to justify what I've just quoted from Paul Krugman. It would be very difficult to say, oh, well, debt isn't bad, it isn't a problem, because after all, one person's debt is another person's asset. If you were a multimillionaire paying a lot in taxes, because the wealthier you are, the more you pay in taxes, morally, why would you feel positively about your tax dollars going to make Microsoft Corporation richer, to some extent to make even foreign investors, the government of Japan, the government of China, own huge amounts of US, to make them richer? Is that what you pay taxes for? And then the problem becomes much more crippling when you talk about middle-class people and poor people who do not have the option to profit from government debt the way Microsoft is. And you ask them, why are you paying taxes? Do you realize that the more and more the American government is in debt, the greater and greater a percentage of your income is going to make the rich richer, and by the same token, it's making you poorer? The left wing in the United States has been in a strangely hobbled position on this issue. The left wing complains, typically, that spending on the military is too high. But the reality is, if you look at the percentage of the American budget that's spent on the military and the percentage that's spent paying interest on the government debt, paying down the government debt, in the next few years, what we're going to see is the military budget shrinking and shrinking, and the percentage of the budget going to pay for debt and deficit servicing expanding and expanding. At some point, and it's not too far in the future, the percentage of your taxpayers' dollars that will be in this way, making the rich richer, paying the interest on debt, will exceed the total budget for the military. This is not to say that the conservatives or the right wing are in a coherent position on this issue. It has been completely bizarre that they've advocated for reduced deficit spending, for better management of debt, in all cases, except when they want to rattle their sabers and go to war, and then they have an attitude that no amount of money is too much to pay when it comes to conquering Afghanistan, a form of public good we all find debatable and dubious at best.
Dun, 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 dun.